What do the
Hi.
panellists make of Keir Starmer's first year in charge of the Labour Party?
Any particular panellist you're aiming this one at?
I think that's painfully obvious. I'd be interested to hear what you have to say.
Saeed, thank you very much for your question. Well, let's start off with you, Jeremy Corbyn, because I'm sure everyone would love to hear your take on the first year of Keir Starmer's leadership.
Leading the Labour Party is not an easy job. And I think you have to be inclusive of all people in the party and make sure their voices are heard and make sure the democracy of the party is fully intact, because that is the absolute lifeblood of it. And I say that as somebody who joined the Labour Party in 1966. I've been 55 years in the Labour Party this year. I've held every position there is in the party, from street collector to leader. And I've often agreed with or disagreed with people, but I've always fought my corner. But I've always fought it in an inclusive way. And I think you should remember that the strength of the Labour movement is the inclusivity of the entirety of its membership and the breadth of its political opinions.
He's not being very inclusive towards you, though, is he? Because you are not actually formally a Labour MP anymore. You're an independent MP.
I'm very proud to be a Member of Parliament for Islington North. I'm a member of the Labour Party at the moment. I'm not a member of the Parliamentary Labour Party. That is not my decision. That is not my wish. And I'm representing the people that I was elected to represent in the first place.
What do you think the best thing he's done over the last year, and what do you think maybe you'd like to have seen done a little different?
I would like us to have been much more assertive against the government on the corona crisis, because I think we haven't challenged them enough on the inefficiency of the private sector track and trace. We haven't challenged them enough on the lack of transparency in the deals that have been done. And it took an awful lot of pressure initially from John McDonnell and John Ashworth in the early part of 2020 to make them even consider, the government that is, even consider a furlough scheme. And the consequences of all this now are serious mental health crisis, poverty, and increasing rates of unemployment in the poorest parts of this country. So I think we could and should have been much sharper against them that time. There was too much inclusivity with the government.
And the thing he's done best?
It's very beguiling when you're the leader of the opposition to be invited into the the big room, where they do all the secret deals. It's got lots of microphones and lights and spotlights and overhead screens and projectors and God knows what. And the coffee is second rate, but there you go. And they try to make you feel absolutely part of it. You're not. You're there because you're the opposition and you're there to ask the questions.
You experienced three different Conservative Prime Ministers, David Cameron, Theresa May and Boris Johnson. Which of those, sorry, it's completely going off the question, but I thought I'd ask it anyway. Which of those did you find most easy to deal with and most productive, and which did you find most difficult?
Well, Boris Johnson was the most light-hearted, as you'd imagine. I'll give an example of this. I phoned him up when he became Prime Minister to congratulate him on that. And I said, sort of at the end of the conversation, it was quite short, I said, is Parliament going to sit through the summer? Is it coming back? Are you going to be around? Is there going to be a recess? Whatever, because it was July. And he said, no, I'm in the boat, my hands are firmly lashed to the oar and I'm paddling away. I said, well, if your hands are lashed to an oar and you're paddling firmly, then this boat is going to go around in circles and continue going around in circles, which he thought was quite good. But then, unfortunately, he completely lost me because he went off into Greek at that point. I was some story about the Greek wars, which completely lost me. Theresa May was extremely serious and very well prepared for every meeting we ever had with her. And we had a number during Brexit issues. And David Cameron was, well, full of being David Cameron. It was like meeting somebody from the Bullingdon Club. It was like meeting a member of the Bullingdon Club.
Right. For the other three on the answer to this question, I'm going to ask you to try to take off your party political hats and become political pundits for the next few minutes. So what do you make of Keir Starmer's first year in charge of Labour? Layla Moran.
Well, first of all, I think I'm quite bewildered by the polls because from what...
Well, you're a Liberal Democrat.
Well, polls for Labour, because given how, the country has suffered one of the highest death rates per capita in the world because of coronavirus. We just had a question about, the chumocracy that we're beginning to see at the top of government. You would expect them to be doing worse. And therefore, your eyes cast to the opposition, of which we are part, I accept that, but you look towards the Labour Party and you're wondering, well, why aren't they landing the blows that they should be landing at this point? So I think that's coming back to Jeremy's point. And there have been points where the prevarication of the Labour Party, sitting on the fence, not taking a position, has been quite frustrating. And I wonder if that is reflected in people not really knowing what Keir Starmer stands for. On the other hand, I'm out door knocking every day, and Oxford West and Abingdon, much as it's touted as a Conservative facing seat, actually we have many of our council seats are Labour facing and many of our council seats are also Tory facing. In the Labour facing seats, actually people like him. They feel that he's serious, that he is forensic, and they want him to do better. So I think the jury is still out, to be perfectly honest. And it's been a strange year in politics where it's been very hard for anyone to get a word in edgeways if you're not the government, because at times of crisis, what people want to hear is what the government has to say, because they want that level of leadership. And I think
that must be quite concerning for you as a Liberal Democrat, though, surely, because you won your seat originally, presumably, by squeezing the Labour vote. And if they think that Keir Starmer is a future Prime Minister, they could take those votes back away from you.
Yes, although the other dynamic that happens, which is a really important one, is that all those swing voters who would normally not vote Labour or would consider other parties suddenly realise that actually Labour are viable. They don't really mind a Labour government, and actually in Tory-facing seats would rather vote Lib Dem in order to kick out the Tory so that they could potentially get a Labour government. So if you look back at Lib Dem seats that have been won over time, actually we tend to do better when you have a rising tide of Labour votes. And the reason for that is because then we can say to Labour voters, well, if you, or people who are considering Labour who sort of might swing between the two, if you actually do want a Labour government, the best thing you should do is to vote Liberal Democrat in those seats. I think these are going to be really interesting elections coming up in May the 6th. I honestly don't know which way they're going to go for any party. I think we could have some quite big surprises on May the 6th, not least because many of the political parties haven't been out there being able to talk to their voters as they normally would. And I'll be really interested to see what happens on the day.
All right, Stuart Hosey, what do you make of Keir Starmer's first year?
He's a very intelligent man. He's a technocrat, and therefore one would have imagined his attention to detail would have contrasted extremely well with Boris Johnson, who has no attention to detail whatsoever. But he hasn't cut through. He hasn't broken through. The poll numbers are extraordinarily bad, given the mistakes and some of the things that are going on within the Tory party and the government. I suspect it probably is because we don't know what he stands for. And the way that he and others have abandoned the Remain cause, which was the real differentiator in large measure, I think leaves people rather cold as to what it is the Labour Party under Keir Starmer actually stand for and what it is they're actually for. So it's a surprise in some ways, but I think the lack of knowing what it is he actually believes in is leaving him open to just being buffeted by the political winds. And the closer and closer and closer we get in the next 18 months, 2 years, 2.5 years to a UK election, unless he's put down a mark as to what it is Labour are for, then I suspect the result for Labour might be pretty bad. But again, time will tell.
Liam.
Well, someone had told me back when we first came to office in 2010 that 11 years later, we'd actually be further ahead in the polls than we were then. I'm not sure I would have believed them. And so from a purely Conservative point of view, it's been excellent that we've been able to establish this level of political dominance. However, I think there are a number of things that you have to take into account. Number one, it's been a very unusual year. Our politics has been dominated by a single issue, where the government's fortunes have fluctuated, determined by whether the public think the government's doing well or not in relation to the crisis. There's no doubt that the phenomenally successful rollout of the vaccine has boosted the government's standing enormously. Below that, I think you've got the personalities of leaders. You've got, if you like, instinct versus intellect in terms of the leaders. There's no doubt that Boris Johnson has got an extraordinarily sharp political instinct. I think that what we saw over the Super League, for example, was a very good example of that. And there's no doubt that Keir Starmer
might come on to that
is very well. There's no doubt that he's very bright, Keir Starmer. But again, it's very difficult to know what is it that differentiates his Labour Party from either the Labour Party that went before or from some of the other parties. And I think there's a wider question, Iain, in this, in that if you're on the centre right of British politics, it's easy to know who you should vote for. If you're on the centre left, it's much more difficult to see. I've always thought there was a clear place for a well-defined social democratic party in the UK politics, and I think there's a place for a socially and economically liberal party in the way that the classic Liberals were. And I remember being on a flight with David Cameron, since Jeremy mentioned leaders, that when we were talking about the Tory party, and he said, I regard myself as a liberal Conservative. Liam, how do you regard yourself? And I thought for a moment, thinking it might be a career-defining answer, and almost certainly was. And I said, well, I regard myself as an unreconstructed free market liberal, Thatcherite, unionist, Eurosceptic Atlanticist.
Covering all your bases there.
It's a fairly broad church in the Tory party. But I think there's a serious point here about differentiation in our politics. And I think that for politicians on the centre left, maybe it's presumptuous for me to say, but there needs to be better definition for people to know what the alternatives to the Conservatives are in government, because history tells us that the Conservatives are the dominant party in British politics unless the opposition has a very clear idea of exactly what it stands for and can vocalise that in a very clear way.
Jeremy, let me just finish off with a question to you, which is directly related to this. You were absolutely brilliant at enthusing the Labour Party troops. You got the membership up to, what was it, 600,000, I think at one point. You could command huge audiences in a way that a more technocratic leader like Keir Starmer never could. But on the other hand, because he's technocratic, people kind of may see him more as a serious alternative Prime Minister than maybe they saw you. It's quite difficult to get that balance, isn't it?
Well, there's a lot of people in this country that feel politics doesn't work for them. They feel unrepresented and feel that nobody's very interested in them, particularly young people. And my whole point of politics is that you've got to speak up for people and offer them some real hope and some real change, which is why I put forward policies on ending tuition fees, on universal free education and public ownership of mail, rail and water. I also said about universal free broadband. Condemned at the time, just about everybody in the world is in favour of it now, including President Biden. So I think the radical policies we put forward did strike a chord with people. But remember this, that the media, I'm not going to go at you here, Iain, the media in this country is not exactly balanced or fair. It is not democratically run or owned in any way. And the levels of abuse that were heaped on senior figures in the Labour Party, including me, for the past 5 years, are absolutely extraordinary by any stretch of the imagination. So I think people should reflect on that. And many of the people that came to our rallies in both the general elections I fought as well as the leadership campaigns came there because they wanted to be able to participate in something. And that's what we were offering.
I take the point about them.
That joined the party were phenomenal. 600,000 members.
No, absolutely. Just on the media point, though, I spent 5 years trying to entice you onto my programme because we'd always had some very good exchanges before you became leader on the programme. Yeah. You were often on. And I tried to entice you over 5 years, and I think John McDonnell was my spokesman with you trying to do that. But it never happened. And I still don't know why, because our listeners were people I would have thought that you should be making every effort to win over. Whether it was your media advisors who took against us for some reason, I don't know, but I found that quite a difficult one.
Handling the media is never easy, and okay, Iain, I'll make up for it. I'll come on again if you'll have me.
I'll hold you to it. We'll have a whole hour together, shall we? We can chew a bit of fat over an hour.